I'm joined today by the political organiser and author James Schneider.
Hello.
Hello, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
In 2016, he served as Director of Strategic Communications for Jeremy Corbyn. He currently serves as Communications Director for Progressive International. And as of this year, he was involved in the founding of the emerging Left Party, your party. But let's talk about your role in that first, James, because you've actually stepped back from that. Can you explain a bit to our listeners your involvement and what you've decided since then?
Yeah, sure. So I ran Jeremy's campaign for Parliament last year, which was great, and obviously we had an excellent win, and that was a lot of fun. And then from that point on, was working with other people towards forming a new party, which has been an interesting and a long process with many twists and turns, and I've learned a lot about things along the way. And now that's almost up and running. You know, we're getting towards the conference. But everybody who's been working on it, myself included when I was working on it, was all a volunteer. And I have, as you read out before, I do a number of different things. And so about a month ago, I stepped back from spending quite so much time on it. So I'm not so fully involved now.
But we're grateful to have you on because you can talk our listeners who are very interested in this new project through sort of how it's been created and the challenges and opportunities for it as well. Sure. So we will talk a bit about that, but with the knowledge that you're not a spokesperson for this
Quite
party.
Right, yeah.
So you've been working on these plans for, I think you've said before in previous interviews, for a year for a new left vehicle. Is that right?
Yeah, since shortly after the general election last year. Yeah, there were people who wanted a new party and Jeremy to lead a new party in the previous parliament. And I always thought that was not where the opening was. And Jeremy also thought the same thing, as you can see, because he didn't found the new party then. Yeah. And I thought that sometime between 6 and 24 months into the Labour government, which would go very badly, they would do very little to improve people's lives, and that would create a large opening. Now, that's happened at the kind of shorter end of that 6 to 24 month spectrum, but started straight away pretty much after the last general election, seeing how a new party could be brought together. And as I said, that's had lots of different twists and turns. It's a non-straightforward process starting a political party if you don't have one of three or more than one of these three conditions, which make it a lot easier. Either you have a hyper leader who says, this is what we're going to do, and everyone follows. So, for example, Jean-Luc Mélenchon in France, who left the Socialist Party, he founded the Parti de Gauche. He could just do that. And then when he decided that the Parti de Gauche was no longer the correct vehicle, he just announced that they're going to create La France Insoumise, and that creates the party. Yeah. We don't have that kind of leader. And of course, that kind of leadership cuts both ways. It makes things easier to start, but it can also cause other problems down the line. Now, Jeremy's very much not like that. He's much more democratic. So he wasn't going to order everyone and say, now we're doing my thing and everyone got to get on board the Jeremy Corbyn show. That's not what he's like at all. Yeah. The second is if you have an already existing structured organisation, a trade union or some other type of organisation that has an agreed decision-making structure, then you can get a political party out of that. And obviously we don't have that, or you have a small group of people with a very high level of alignment around everything, not just what the political positions are, but the fundamental political strategy and operations. And we haven't had that on the left either. It should be no surprise to new Statesman listeners that the left can be a slightly disputatious place, and getting people all on exactly the same page can be difficult. So it's been a long process. Trying to move towards having a decision-making structure that everyone can agree on, which is why there's this push towards having the founding conference next month, because then finally the party can both be fully founded and it can have a sovereign decision-making structure with its root in the membership.
Yeah, because it has had quite a few teething problems, which we've discussed in depth on the podcast before, so we won't go too much into them. But it was originally launched before it really existed. There's been recent confusion over membership sign-ups and payments. And do you think sort of those are symptoms of the fact that it didn't have those three conditions that you've just been talking us through? Or, is this more personality-led problems?
Well, I think those two things go together, actually. I think in those structural conditions that I laid out, I think both people's personalities and how they interact with each other, that becomes more important basically than it would in other conditions. And so that's caused some challenges, I would say. And also when you have the conditions where you don't have a full decision-making body that everybody accepts, things can tend to go a bit around in circles, and that leads to frustration and sometimes to perhaps rash actions. So these are teething problems. Now, I hope, and while I think it's fair to say that for people involved, not just the people closely involved, but for hundreds of thousands or perhaps in the low millions of people around the country who are excited about this, who want something different, these teething problems, as you put them, have been quite painful. And they really have. But my hope is that once the party is actually set up, it has democratic structure, has decision-making structure, I hope we'll view this slightly difficult launch period a bit like you view your GCSEs. They were incredibly important when you were taking them. They were all-consuming. You really want to do them. 2 years later, you don't remember them that much, and in 5 years' time, it's a kind of irrelevance because you've gone and done other things. So hopefully, once the party is set up, it will begin to do many other things. It will begin to organise with the great mass of the people in the country. It will make the political arguments that we need to see against both the do-nothing Labour government and the hard right of reform. And that will change how people think and feel about the party. Okay. And potential future flashpoints coming up are a leadership election. We've just published a story on the New Statesman website based on the draft founding documents of the parties that suggest there'll be one leader rather than a co-leadership structure. That could put members in the position of choosing between Jeremy Corbyn or Zara Sultana, for example. I'm not saying they're the only people who might be up for it. Could that be a problem? Could that alienate sort of one faction of this movement? Well, it isn't necessarily going to be a leadership election in that way for just one leader, because my understanding of these draft documents is these are draft documents now that are out for consultation, debate, editing, and they're going to be debated and voted on both at the conference and by all members of the parties. So nothing like that is particularly set in stone. And I think the point about a political party, when it is really set up, or any structured democratic organisation, including trade unions, tenants' unions, and so on, they can accept, people within that organisation can accept that they don't win all of the time. Because no one wins all of the time in every decision. That's completely normal. But you have democratic structures to say, this is how we're going to decide something. Now it's decided, we all get on board with the decision. And there's some mechanism for redress or changing the decision. There's some process and procedures. And hopefully that's what this conference will then give. So if there is a leadership election between, one person and another person, just like in any other political party, you would hope, where people on the same page fundamentally, whoever wins, people would come together around. But also, as I say, that's not the only, what is published in draft doesn't mean that's what's going to happen. That's the first draft for people's views in the country. Okay. And lastly, on the specifics of sort of the founding of your party, which I'm calling it doesn't have a name yet. The conference is due in November. What can we expect to come out of that conference? Are they going to vote on a name in that conference, for example? So I think there are the four founding documents, a political statement, a constitution, standing order and rule book, and an organisational strategy. And those will all go through this process. I think it just started this weekend, these big regional deliberative meetings to discuss those papers. Then they will be amended and edited. Eventually, the delegates to the conference will be able to amend it, debate, vote, and then it will go to all-member vote online for each of those things. So at the end of it, the party should have a political statement. What's it about? It should have a constitution that governs it. It should have rulebook and standing orders, and it should have an organisational strategy that governs it for the next year, says this is what we are now going to do. Basically setting it up so it's ready to rock and roll. Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. Thank you so much for taking us through it. And I know that you've spoken a lot about how this has to work differently from, existing establishment political parties. Can you talk us through that a bit? You've spoken about a grassroots democratic participation being the sort of main basis for the party. How does that actually work in practice? I just want to start from a different place because, yes, I think the party needs to be democratic, and that will make it different to, say, the Labour Party, but it doesn't make it particularly different to, say, the Green Party, which also operates as far as I can see. I mean, I'm not in it, but as I can see from the outside, it's a very democratic party as well. I think the single most important thing the party needs to do is recognise that we are at the end of 50 years of massive counter-revolution, which has wiped away huge amounts of built-up democratic working class power and organisation throughout the country. And that if we only pursue the electoral and the parliamentary route, we won't have the sufficient underlying power that if we are able to get into office, that we will be able to carry through the programme on which we would be elected on. So I think that the party has to do three fundamental things. One is to build popular unity amongst the overwhelming majority of people, amongst the working class majority in the country, which is a huge challenge because the only politics that the right have, the only politics really that are left for the status quo are those of division. That is their strategic role, to blame Muslims, migrants and minorities for everything. So the forging of popular unity is an absolutely crucial strategic thing. The second is creation of popular power. So we need to rebuild after that 50 years of counter-revolution, we need to rebuild the rich fabric of social life, tenants' unions, trade unions, community kitchens, workers' centres, social centres, all of these things. We need to rebuild those so that there is once more power in working class communities. If you look at the last election and you look at the areas where independents came from effectively nowhere, came from effectively nowhere to defeat Labour or come close to Labour, that was based in existing social power. Generally speaking, existing social power that was organised through mosques. Now, that type of power used to exist much more broadly in society, and that has to be the fundamental strategic task. And then the third is building a popular alternative, which you build up, yes, through making your arguments in the media and in Parliament, but you also build up through that building of popular power, through building up of tangible demands from people who are organising for themselves to improve their own lives now. So it's a different type of party from just the idea of having basically a parliamentary party. If you look at Westminster now, if you look at the main theory of most all the political parties there, while they have different politics, their theory of change is the same. Their theory of change is you gather up members, supporters and donors who broadly agree with one another. They finance electoral campaigns and sustain a parliamentary operation with the goal of winning reforms in the direction that you want through the existing state machinery. They all have this, reform to the Greens. They have the same theory of change. Now, my argument is that, especially in conditions where social power, democratic social power has been so stripped away, but also generally in history, that does not yield sustainable progressive changes. It can yield some good, some good reforms, some mild reforms, which would be certainly welcome. But for example, the huge victories that were won for the majority of people in Britain after World War II, for example, which were won on the back of a huge increase in working class democratic organisation throughout the country, would not have been won if you did not have all of those institutions. And those institutions are not just in the workplace, they're also in the community, they're also the libraries, they are also the working men's clubs and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you about this because as part of my job, Britain editor, I go around the country a lot. I often speak to people who work in the kind of organisations that, have been stripped away in a lot of communities. And often that, they really recoil from the idea of being associated with a political party or even talking politics. Obviously everything is political, but in the party political sense, is there not a danger of trying to hijack organisations that are doing good work in their communities if you're trying to build this bottom-up thing? It's
not about hijacking. We have hugely insufficient, think about where you live and think back 50 years to where you live. There would have been a workers' centre. There would have been community-owned property. There would have been places where you could have some form of real, meaningful democratic power and places to socially organise. Now we don't have those things. Yeah. So I'm not saying what we need to do is lasso together just the remnants of a previous order. The purpose of having a party that can stimulate, can be a catalyst for this type of bottom-up democratic power building is because if you just said we are going to do democratic bottom-up power building, you wouldn't have 800,000 people signing up in 2 weeks. You can if you say that there's going to be a political party. And then the question is, what does membership of a political party mean? Is it, as we have grown accustomed to in the social media age, that we look at, in the media or to parliaments to see what the political leaders are doing and then post about it online? That's been the main point. Now, of course, many people have done other things more productive and better, but that has been the kind of normative form of political engagement. And that doesn't build power. I mean, we're doing it on platforms that we don't own, that send us horrible things. And, we don't have to go down that particular rabbit hole, although all of our minds have all been wrapped and sent down that rabbit hole by those algorithms. So I think we have to create a different idea of what does it mean to be a member of a political party. Are you always looking to the parliamentary leadership and what your opinions are on the issues of the day? Or are you organising where you are with other people who have similar issues to build power in a sustainable way? Because that way we can win an election, but on a sustainable basis where we could be in power for a decent amount of time and do real meaningful change, to seriously roll back the level of the destruction of public services and their commodification, the control that capital has over everybody's lives, to democratize elements of the state. We could do all of those things. But just, let's take things back to when Jeremy was leader of the Labour Party.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, you're speaking from experience here, right? Yeah.
So, we had good policies. 2017, 2019, this was a good programme for change in Britain. If they'd been carried out, the lives of the majority of people in Britain would be better. But the idea that we'd be able to carry them all through in the state without enormous pushback and therefore without the need for enormous levels of mobilisation and organisation from popular democratic forces is completely for the birds. When there is I remember laughing endlessly before the last election at all the professional politics understanders. I won't name any names, but some of them may occasionally sit in this studio. And all of these professional politics understanders were saying, well, Labour, they're being very cautious. They don't want to drop the Ming vase, but just you see, when they get into government, the real Keir Starmer's radicalism will come out, etc. And you say, has there been any political party basically in history that has been more radical in office than it has been in opposition? No, because the huge weight of pressure is mainly coming from the ruling class side, through the media, through corporate lobbyists, through all of these things. So the idea that you can just win elections and through a supposedly neutral civil service, carry out left technocratic reforms that are going to change the country is not right. You need a much more active process. I tell you that there's I remember this very vividly because it was one of the moments where I thought, oh my God, we're in trouble. In 2019, during the Access talks, that's when the opposition get to go and speak to the senior civil servants about their agenda. And one senior member of staff went to go have those talks and came back, and I asked them, how was it? And they said, I think the single stupidest thing I've ever heard a human being say, which is, it was fantastic. They are so excited about carrying through our transformational program. And you think, oh my God. I mean, you've just had the wool completely pulled over your eyes, and you have to be, very firm. And unless you have huge numbers of really singular and impressive people, huge numbers, fighting back on that cannot just be done by the people. It needs to have a huge movement. You get occasional things like in 2017 when John McDonnell went in for those Access talks, he's a singular impressive individual, went in for those Access talks and he said, we're going to have an emergency budget. I need you to prepare it. It would happen, in X weeks, and here are the key measures we need to do. People need a respite. They said, oh, that's very difficult. we've got this bill. Have you considered this? We could just do this one for you. And he obviously looked at it, and it was what they prepared for Theresa May and what was his name? Fiscal Phil. What was his name? Phil Hammond. And obviously he said, no, this is ridiculous. We're going to do the thing, blah, blah, blah. But in order to then force that through, you need to have a huge organised democratic power in society.
Right. Okay. Brilliant. Thank you. And let's just look at the current political landscape. Reform UK seems to be the main viable alternative to Labour or Tories in voters' eyes at the moment. Mm-hmm. Is there anything that this new left vehicle could learn from Nigel Farage and Reform, do you think?
Beyond have a simple story, not really. I mean, that Reform and the kind of greater reform, it's not just the private company owned by Nigel Farage and the kind of rotating cast of MPs when they get kicked out or not kicked out or cross over from the Tories or whatever. The greater reform, large sections of the media ecosystem and a number of pundits and so on. They have a very simple argument that the economic problems that you face, they are real. Your wages really haven't gone up. You really can't get a GP appointment. Your energy bills are really going up. This is genuinely really bad. And it is all the fault of Muslims, migrants and minorities. And they present that as an economic argument. Of course, there's a dog whistle and sometimes much, very loud dog whistle towards racism. But the main argument that they're putting forward is an economic argument. Now, the reason why that's doing so well is that argument is up against the Labour Party's argument, which is, no, actually everything's fine and it's getting better and all you need is more delivery. It's the kind of Sunak Starmer continuity government. Same point, same thing, delivering nothing apart from polling numbers to reform. In response to that, you need from the progressive end of politics, and Zach Polanski has started doing it and is doing it very well, you need to have a very simple argument, which also happens to be the truth, that the reason why things are getting worse for the overwhelming majority of people is because those at the extreme top have taken everything. And you can show that in the wealth of billionaires, in profit levels, in what multinational companies are doing, in the profits of energy giants, and so on and so forth. And that, I think, is the only thing that you particularly want to learn from reform. I think often there is an attempt on the left to look at things that the right have done and gone, well, if only we did that exact same thing. And the problem is you're playing in a completely different position. The right and the centre they wish to maintain the fundamental coordinates of social rule. They want things to not particularly change very much. Of course, they will like people with different coloured ties to have ministerial boxes, and they like their pet projects to go more in this way rather than that way. But the fundamental coordinates of society, they want to maintain the same. Now, the centre think they keep them the same by sort of just going, yeah, everything's fine, we'll just keep on going. And the right think they have to the further right keep everything the same by deepening and intensifying existing inequalities. But then if you wish to change that structure, it's not just a question of engaging on the level of political communication, which of course you have to do. You have to do it on the fundamental level of power. And the fundamental level of power that ordinary people have, the only one that we really have, is to organise together in democratic organisations, trade unions, tenants unions, community organisations, whatever it is, to build up power to take on the entrenched power that the tiny few have, who have a whole set of different mechanisms. There is no progressive democratic media, or it's very, very small, whereas the billionaire media is enormous. People's media tiny, billionaires' media enormous. Now, given that politics is played through communications substantially, the idea that you can just do the same thing as the right when the field is tilted in a totally different direction is wrong.
I did want to ask, the basis of the strategy that you've been laying out. You've said that you've identified 3 constituencies for this new party to focus on: the asset poor working class, downwardly mobile graduates and racialised communities. How did you break down the demographics in this way? What's the thinking behind that?
So those 3 groups, this is not to say that any party should only focus on these particular social constituencies which have enormous overlap amongst each other. of course, but they should be the core that a social majority is based upon. So the first starting point, and some people will just say, no, it's just working class, right? It's just working class. And in a way, I am saying that, but that the working class is not a static object. It is something that is always in construction and deconstruction. And what we have had for the last 50 years is a big process of class deconstruction, deconstructing the things which make the working class for itself, as in working class power, not as a question of identity, but as a question of collective power that can be brought to bear in a democratic way. So, looking at these three social constituencies is what makes up the social majority. So, why asset poor working class? By which I mean people who work or used to work in working class jobs that don't somehow have a larger amount of asset wealth than their earning potential. Part of the story that we've seen in the so-called Red Wall narrative, quite a lot of that, not all of it, but quite a lot of that has been the mislabeling of I think of places which were absolute bastions of working class power, which had huge union density, towns with one or two major industries. With those major industries are gone, so this is a process of class deconstruction that has taken place, and so you have in those places a lot of people that either used to have working class jobs or were part of that community and were associated with it, whose economic futures is more linked to their house price than it is to their earning potential because of the changes that have happened in those places. This is not a moral or ethical assessment. This is a sociological analysis, right? Then downwardly mobile graduates. In the past, graduates were on the early rung of the professional ladder, and the professional ladder generally took people in the direction towards the status quo, not having fundamental interest in change. But with the twin effects of huge soaring, basically two things that Blair did: the hyper-financialization of the housing market and the massive expansion of higher education means that you've in each age cohort you've got about 50% of the population who are given degrees, who of course are saddled with debt and are unlikely to earn as much as if their parents were professional, as much as their parents. Of course, not all their parents are because of the huge expansion, and struggle to buy a house, struggle to live near their friends if they can buy a house. Childcare is extremely expensive. All of these, all of these things. So that opens up to bring over into the popular camp this huge group of people who may not have traditionally working class jobs, but are part of have the same demographic interests. And of course, there's crossover between those two. And then the third, racialized people, who, of course, disproportionately are represented in both those two former categories, but also have a particular interest in allying with this popular bloc, because the main strategy for the ruling class to continue its rule now, because it has no idea how to improve people's lives, is that of division. And therefore is that of racism, of attacks on migrants, Muslims, minorities, and so on. So those three groupings, I think, can make up a sociological majority and could make up a social majority. Also, in an electoral sense, you can target particular constituencies where those three groups make up a supermajority, a big supermajority, and there are a lot of those in England. So you could have you could envisage circumstances where a well-focused, well-organized, well-directed strategic party was able to make both quick organizing inroads in some places and fairly quick electoral inroads.
This is a bit of a crass question, but do you have an idea of how many seats that sort of situation could possibly work in? I've heard that I've heard rumours of targets of 50 or so seats with those conditions.
Sure. You always, with seat targeting, whether that's for social targeting or for electoral targeting, you have a kind of core and a stretch, right? So you could say the core might be 50, the stretch might be 150. My argument would always be that the way that we should measure success is not just in how many seats are won, but how many seats are won in a sustainable fashion, because you have built up an organised social majority in that area to the point at which it's very hard to imagine another party coming along and winning, which is what if you look at 100 years ago with the Labour Party, the building up of organised working class power particularly in industrial towns, meant that the Labour Party was going to always take a political expression. The Labour Party was always going to win. And it actually takes a long time for that after that power is gone for the politics to change. Yeah. Part of the shock of the Red Wall phenomenon is that that's the political expression of something which had happened 20, 30 years ago.
It's like a star dying, you still see it in the sky before it dies. Let's go back to those groups that you were just talking about, because we have seen a little bit of the potential tensions between trying to represent different communities in your party. So differences between Zara Sultana and her fellow Independent Alliance MP Adnan Hussein over trans rights. And also there's been a bit of a tension over landlordism as well. Shokat Adam, when I interviewed him, another one of the Independent Alliance MPs, said they shouldn't be the party against landlords, and he is one, along with Ayub Khan. So how do you reconcile these potentially different values, different outlooks on life within the movement?
So I'll take the landlord point second, but to start with, going back, I said that of the three main strategic goals of the party, its acts of construction are to construct popular unity. So there are obvious cleavages, cultural and social cleavages among the social majority, which are going to be attempted to be exploited by its opponents, always. And also, people from within the coalition will also naturally spark off against one another. So that has to be actively constructed. You have to work very hard, I think, to bring together the different groups. On the issue that you particularly raise with trans rights, I think the way in which you hold that big majority is you make our politics being against prejudice. Prejudice is a strategic weapon of the ruling order. They use it in a very clear, very effective way. And we have to be opposed to prejudice as not only for moral purposes, not only because it is the right thing to do, not only to defend people who are under attack, but as a fundamental strategy to win. And I think the thing that you have to say is let's say a Muslim or a Christian with more traditional views, let's say a Muslim with more traditional views, does not have to hold all of the same views on gender as a trans person does, just has to recognize that the same forces which are spewing Islamophobia are the same forces which are spewing hatred against trans people, and that they have to stand fundamentally aligned to one another. This is about alliances. This is about shared interests. This is about shared strategy. It's not trying to say that everybody has to agree with everything else. That's a fantasy. It's never happened. There's never been a mass democratic movement that has become powerful where everybody agrees on every issue. It's not possible. But I think those things can and must be held together through articulating an extremely firm politics against prejudice. And we've seen this at different times beforehand, political leaders doing this in a way which doesn't compromise their personal belief system, but has them playing that collective role. So you've seen in the past, for example, people who are socially conservative Catholics who themselves will be opposed to abortion, but will vote in favour of abortion rights because they personally wouldn't do that, but they don't think the state should intervene. And I think we can look at ways like that. And the more that our politics, this goes back to the point about building power and building power in person with people in places where they live and work, you can have that conversation much more easily. The problem is if our conversations and our politics is mainly being mediated on Twitter, which is algorithmically designed to rage farm and designed to not bring together consensus, we're just deepening the same dynamics that we already have. What has happened to the left in this last 50 years of counter-revolution is through smashing mass working class organizations, the left has then been squeezed back into academia and NGOs. And part of the problem of being squeezed into academia and NGOs, and this is not against people who are academics and not against people who work in NGOs who do very good work, but structurally, the incentives in academia are towards making the more radical point from someone else. It's the small points of difference that you succeed. And in NGOs, it's being able to simultaneously say a radical thing, but perhaps not particularly do a radical thing because of your funders, or to have a more radical discourse than another one, which is not about building majoritarian power. So we need to be, I think through the process of building real power in real people's daily lives, through building tenants unions, through community kitchens and so on, some of those conversations will begin to happen and reshape the way in which we think about our politics.
Right. Okay. And I wonder, what lessons do you draw specifically about that from your time working for Corbyn's Labour? I know that there was, a drive to try and embed these community organisers in certain places. And of course, you're the co-founder of Momentum as well, which was a network of activists who could do work like this. What were the barriers to it? I know obviously that there was sort of a time restraint in terms of the electoral calendar, but what did you learn from trying to build that kind of network?
So it has to be done as an intense strategic focus, which we were never able to do. So I'll start with Momentum. In the first paper that I wrote about what should come after the leadership campaign, which I've probably written in early August 2015, I said the Momentum, well, I didn't call it Momentum, but the organisation should sit between the Labour Party and movements, act as a go-between between them and to stimulate more social movements, and laid out that a strategic goal should be to build a national tenants union, and that the national tenants union should then be allied to Corbyn's Labour Party. Now, as you know, that obviously didn't happen. And the reason why that didn't happen is because our strategic focus had to be on fighting within the party, despite wanting to do other things. So partly it's, there were other things going on. Then within the party itself, you're referring to the community organising unit. Yeah. So we announced that in the leadership campaign in 2016 that should Jeremy win again, we would set that up, and we have pretty good plans for it. And of course, that was stalled and prevented by Ian McNicol and the Labour Party bureaucracy that was still in place at the time. And I don't think we managed to set it up until 2018, after Ian McNicol had been removed as General Secretary, and some other changes had been able to be made within the bureaucracy to put it more in line with the strategy which had been voted on and elected overwhelmingly twice by the bulk of the party's membership. So that only had maybe 18 months. It was small. It had a tangible electoral effect in the seats where they had community organisers. They did 2% better than otherwise. Now, 2% doesn't sound like very much, but it's certainly something observable in less than 18 months. Generally speaking, with one organiser in an area, with generally speaking a kind of hostile and uncooperative regional office working against what they were what they were doing. But also you have to remember that the community organising shouldn't be judged by what electoral returns it can get in 18 months' time. You know, this is a long-term project of power building. And it needs to be I strongly think for the party needs to be a huge strategic focus. It needs to be a thing when people think, I am proud to have this card in my pocket that I'm a member. And I also think the Green Party should do the same thing. They should make these same changes. I'm proud to do this. It's not just because you see Jeremy or Zara or Zach or anyone else saying and doing good things on your social media feed. It is because you are also involved in building power with a politicized header, not as charity, not as service delivery, but as building people's power where they are. And that is what the main bulk of our political activity that we need to be doing in the coming years.
You said in an interview with the New Left Review back in the summer that the Greens have had virtually no effect on public consciousness. I wonder how you feel. Have you changed your opinion on that since Zach Polansky has won the Green Party leadership contest? And you've been, praising some of the things that he's been doing in the first half of this podcast.
Yeah, so when I said that in July, that was absolutely objectively the case, I think. And Zach has done an extremely good job, I think, both running for leader and then in the 6 weeks or so since he's become leader, of punching through into popular consciousness by making, as we were talking about before, the clear and simple arguments about how it is the super rich and big business and banks in this country that have sucked all the wealth away from ordinary people. And that if we're going to do something about that, we need to build massive power amongst ordinary people to tax the rich and to change things. It's a good argument. He's making it well. So he has pushed through. The other points that I made in that interview go more to questions of fundamental strategy, which is not your communication strategy, which I think he's doing extremely well, your fundamental strategy for how you will bring about significant social change. And that's the points that I was making before about parliamentary reform through the state.
Yes, because you've called it self-deluding nonsense in that same interview. This idea that together with the Greens, a new left party could hold the balance of power in Westminster. I suppose that's always the idea. You try and win as many seats as possible to try and influence the party in power.
Yeah, I've always thought that's completely ludicrous, self-justificatory argument. It was made before the last election that the Socialist Campaign Group should just sit quietly because they could hold the balance of power if Labour had a small majority or a minority government.
I remember that. Yeah,
it's absolute nonsense. If the Labour Party would absolutely love to do a deal with parties to its so-called right, the Lib Dem, whether the Lib Dems are to the right of Labour, whatever, but, with Lib Dems and to parties to the right to own the left, they'd absolutely adore doing it. If you're going into Parliament genuinely as socialists, you have to realise that everyone that is not in your camp is opposed to and is more aligned with one another, fundamentally. Keir Starmer is much closer to Nigel Farage in his politics than he is to Jeremy Corbyn, Zach Polansky or Zara Sultana. Much, much closer.
Okay, well, can you explain to our listeners why you say that? That's quite a big statement. Some of them might be quite surprised by it.
I think it works both on the surface and on the fundamental level. On the surface level, if you look at the political positions that are being taken up by Keir Starmer and Nigel Farage on all the major issues, they are far closer to one another than to Zach Polansky, Jeremy Corbyn and Zara Sultana. If you look at, let's pick a few issues. Wealth tax. He's in the same position as Nigel Farage. If you look at positions on welfare, he's in the same position as Nigel Farage, not on the other ones. If you look at questions of foreign policy, not just Gaza, but of course Gaza, he's in the same position as Nigel Farage, but also our fundamental relationships in the world with the Imperial United States, they're in the same position. These are in a different position. So I think on all of these surface points of their politics, they are. But then on the more fundamental level, which goes back to, do you think that society should fundamentally change, and it should fundamentally change in the interest of the many, not the few? And that means that those that have hoarded all of this wealth and power need to lose some of this wealth and power so that everybody can be an equal human and live with equal dignity. Keir Starmer doesn't want the fundamental change, and nor does Nigel Farage. They have a different method in how the fundamental change. Keir Starmer thinks, like Rishi Sunak, that if you just sort of do managerial delivery with a sclerotic state and a completely useless political class trying to manage the state, that somehow we will all just go back into our pre-2008 financial crash world where we just think, oh, yeah, the economy, it's probably run by clever people. And yeah, politics is a bit annoying, but it's probably run in our interests. Like, that's not going to happen. And Nigel Farage's solution is to say what we need to do is we need to take the existing inequalities and inequities and we need to drive them deeper in order to secure them, in order to hold on to them, in order to secure the current distribution of wealth and power in society. It needs to be made even less equal, even more extremely hoarded. And, you know, Jeremy Corbyn, Zara Sultana, Zach Polanski, all perhaps in slightly different ways, want to see fundamental change in society. They want to see power shifted really quite dramatically in society, away from those that have it towards those that don't have it. I mean, Jeremy as well, and Zara, I know less about Zach's international politics, but Jeremy and Zara as well have an understanding of our role in the world within an imperial structure with US imperialism, with over 800 military bases around the world, starting wars, overthrowing governments. They also have that frame where Starmer and Farage are in exactly the same position. So really, I don't see an enormous difference. Of course, I would, you know, one is a nicer guy than the other, probably, maybe, you know, I know one of them. I know Keir Starmer, worked with him for years. Yeah. I would rather Keir Starmer. It is a less horrible flavour of establishment rule, but it's still establishment rule.
Okay. And what about this idea of a pact? I mean, how would it work? You know, should there still be two separate parties, the Greens under Zach Polanski and this new left party under, you know, whoever wins that election, if there is a leadership election? Or should they exist as two separate entities but work together? What do you think? What do you think would be the best way for them to interact?
So I've said from the beginning that I would really like to see an electoral pact between the two. I think that they speak to slightly different constituencies. Yeah. I think they could be more than the sum of their parts. And I also think that you could generate some kind of, at least in the in the near term, additional excitement by having open primaries but with two competing parties. Is a bit more media exciting. So, you know, let's look at the Mamdani primary campaign in New York and look at what we have coming up in 2028, which are quite big mayoral elections in London, in the northeast, in Manchester, in Liverpool, in around Bristol, in the West Midlands, and so on. Now, you could, all of those places, if we're going back to where is there a supermajority, sociological majority for a kind of popular bloc, it's in those places. So you can see there's a potential for major parts of the country to be won over by progressive forces, Green, your party, whatever it is, at that point, which is 1 year out from an election. To me, that seems like a potential strategic turning point. And I think part of the way in which you could win those elections or do very well in those elections is you'd have to get candidates who have big personalities and they get lots of attention. And how do you do that from an outsider's position? Well, I think if you ran joint primaries between the Greens and your party or whatever it ends up being called, for example, in those cities or metropolitan regions, in the year before, two candidates from the Greens, two candidates from your party, whatever it is, there's more of a sense of jeopardy. It would be more exciting. It would get more attention. You'll be much more likely to go around the country and covering it. Are the Greens going to win this one? Is your party going to win this one? What's going on? Maybe is this candidate more close to that candidate? And you could develop the infrastructure in all of these places ready for the elections the following year, as well as build membership, raise money, and surface, hopefully, new candidates who can be real leaders. So I think there are exciting potential things. The longer term scenario, who knows? I mean, it's too hard to predict what would happen that far in the future. But I think, it seems to me odd, the idea that at the 2029 election, you would have in winnable seats two parties who are more similar to one another than they are to any other party running against each other. Now, there are lots of different ways that could work out. The Greens could get a free run at 15 and your party could get a free run at 40. Who knows? And then you could do joint primaries for an extra 50 or 100 or whatever it is. And then for the rest, you both run paper candidates perhaps, or maybe only the Greens run paper candidates. I don't know. There are lots of different ways in which you can do that. And I think the chance of doing politics in a different way is itself quite exciting and quite a positive thing.
That's interesting. I do wonder whether some of our listeners might ask, who are trying to decide, between which of these parties to support, why not just have one? Is it not a bit confusing? Would a joint primary not necessarily work in terms of, surfacing the divisions within the left in this country, for example? Maybe that might be a bit confusing or off-putting.
Well, I mean, you're going to have primaries for the candidates within the parties anyway.
Yeah.
It's either going to be a process which people don't really know about, don't hear about, and don't engage with, or it's one that has the potential to grab some attention and surface a powerful candidate. I would rather take the risk and go for the second one. Right. On the why isn't there just one party point, and we have to deal with the world as it is. There isn't just one party. There was the Green Party existed. And for huge numbers of people on the left, they looked at the Green Party and thought, I just don't think that's going to do the thing. For whatever reason, I don't think it's going to do the thing. Now, that huge number of people on the left might be a slightly smaller huge number of people on the left after Zach Polansky's done a good job starting off as leader. But still, there are lots of people on the left going, I don't think that's the right thing. There'll also be other people on the left who go, I'm not sure about this new party thing. It's not quite going in the way in which, I'm not so sure. So let's go with the Greens. And I think for now, that's fine. I mean, also, Zach is a grown up, Zara's a grown up, Jeremy's a grown up. They all get on. It's, I think that's all fine. Maybe one day that will all come into one political vehicle. Maybe it won't. But I think electorally, you want to get to a position where at the next election, things are basically down. There's a progressive bloc, there's an establishment bloc, and there's a reactionary bloc, and the progressive bloc needs to be united. Right.
Okay. Brilliant. Thank you. And you mentioned Mamdani earlier. I just wondered what you think can be learned from his campaign, or, is there a danger of sort of perhaps putting too much emphasis on this idea of the need for a charismatic leader or charismatic character?
So, yes, obviously, we can overread into, and always do overread into, any level of success. And while Zohran Mamdani is obviously a very charismatic and skilled politician, he's very good at speaking, he's very charming, his candidacy came out of the Democratic Socialists of America in New York structure. He learnt how to campaign, going through a series of other campaigns, working on different campaigns in that structure. He's not the only candidate that's ever come through. So they have a structure that generates the kind of skilled political leaders like he is. Now, I'm not saying that he's got everything right. There are some things that he has done, particularly since winning, that I disagree with. But it's extremely exciting that someone who has broadly progressive politics and is not afraid to say them. It could be the mayor, or is, I think, odds on to be the mayor of the imperial city of the world. It's pretty good.
Yeah, and just lastly, because you know Corbyn well, you've worked for him for a long time. He'll be 80 at the time of the next election. Do you think, could he be up for the job of being the leader of this new entity? What do you think, sort of personally, what's your personal opinion?
I don't like to look too far into the future. I think that the role that Jeremy was always going to play, especially if you know him and the things he thinks about, he's not a big ego guy. He's not desperate to be the dictator telling people what he wants to do. But he knows that something quite remarkable happened when he was leader of the Labour Party. For the first time in our lifetimes, there was a genuinely progressive alternative that could have formed the next government, and that has raised the expectations of millions of people, and that needs to be given political shape and political form, and that's what he is committed to doing. The role in which he plays in that, I think, for him always, especially because he's movement first, ego second type person, is always a secondary issue. Right. He clearly has a very important role to play. He has the biggest national profile. He has the biggest level of authority. He also just has a phenomenal track record of being on the right side of history on basically every single question for 50 plus years. He isn't suddenly going to zigzag and veer off in a bad direction. And there's a lot of value in that. It's part of the reason why when he ran for leader in 2015, and again when the party was announced this year, almost everyone, of course not everyone, but almost everyone on the left went, yes, I trust that, I'm in some way, because and he will have that, he will have that forever. That doesn't mean that he needs to be the parliamentary leader or whatever, but he has an absolutely vital role to play, I think, going forward.